Maxwell Knight, a British spy master during World War II, saw the benefit of employing female spies, especially if they were able to use sex to gather secrets. As he said, they should not be markedly oversexed or undersexed. It is difficult to imagine anything more terrifying than for an officer to become landed with a woman agent who suffers from an overdose of sex. Nothing is easier for a woman to gain a man's confidence by the showing and expression of a little sympathy. This may not come as a huge surprise, but during the first half of the 20th century, prostitutes were used to expand Japan's influence abroad. In Germany, the Nazis housed foreign diplomats in their brothels, where they would be recorded talking to Salon kitties as they were called. Plus, there was even a cross-dressing Qing dynasty princess, a one-legged American brothel owner in France, and a great deal more. Now, if this world of intrigue, espionage, wars and the like sparks your curiosity, well then, I can confidently say that you will love Curiosity Stream. Think of it like Netflix for nerds, as they host a huge collection of award-winning and exclusive documentaries. So let's say you want a little more history. Well then you can check out Pompeii, the mystery of the people frozen in time. But for a little more 20th century history, well then there's The Man Who Cracked the Nazis' Code. This looks at how the socially awkward genius Alan Turing helped break the Nazi Enigma code, greatly assisting the Allies in the war. So obviously a must-watch if World War II espionage is your thing. Otherwise there's a whole host of other categories you could delve into, like science, nature, society, or you could join me in a little true crime. There are thousands of movies and TV shows on there for you, including 35 collections of curated programs handpicked by their experts. So use a promo code JABSY to sign up, and you can get access to this whole library for just $14.99. That's $14.99 for the whole year to have thousands of titles at your fingertips. And I do mean at your fingertips, as you can stream to any device, anytime, anywhere. So you could maybe watch some amazing titles on your way to work every day for just $14.99. That's the same price as a couple of coffees. But to get that whole year at this price, again use the promo code JABSY and follow the link below. I'm sure you will enjoy the Hulu for history buffs that is Curiosity Stream. This whole concept of prostitute spies obviously predates the 20th century. John M. Belolavec, for instance, wrote a book covering their involvement in the Mexican-American War. Then going right the way back to ancient times, the Israelites had the help of a prostitute spy when they conquered Jericho. Her name was Rahab and she housed a couple of Israelite spies and helped them escape. So when the walls of the town were brought down and the city was captured, she was spared. But Maxwell Knight, the spy who took to employing female spies during the war, disagreed with this. Now he was a former fascist, but left the party to join what would become MI5. His female spies often targeted the fascists and communist groups within the UK, but as I said, he was against using prostitutes or anyone too promiscuous. He claimed, "It is important to stress that I am no believer in what may be described as Mata Hari methods." Mata Hari, by the way, was a Dutch dancer who pretended to have come from Indian descent. After her divorce, she began to strip down to essentially nothing, and this enthralled the crowds across Europe. As she got older, she began to seduce powerful men, and during the First World War, as Netherlands was neutral, she could meet high-ranking French, Russian and German men. The French tried to use this and employed her as a spy, but later on the French accused her of being a double agent and executed her. But whether or not she was actually a double agent or not is still open to debate. Meanwhile, across the other side of the world, the Japanese were looking to expand their influence across Asia, and this expansion was largely led by a group of prostitutes known as the Karayuki-San. This translates to Miss Gone to China, as originally in the late 19th century, many impoverished Japanese women would travel there to work in brothels. But over time, agents went to the poorer towns and villages in Kyushu primarily, and sent them further afield. Sometimes these agents would actually buy the girls from their own families. Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Australia, and even Eastern Russia became popular destinations. Some Japanese people saw this as an outrage, and they believed that it undermined their national prestige around the world. For instance, an emigre in Australia named Sasaki Shigetoshi petitioned to have the prostitutes expelled. He said, "We Japanese are exceedingly inferior now because of the display of the likes of these filthy prostitutes. If we want to exaggerate this superiority over the Japanese, by means of our Japanese nation being the England of the East, the first thing that should be initiated is the eradication of prostitutes of this sort." But the Black Dragon Society and other pan-Asian and ultra-nationalist groups saw these women as heroes. They called them Roshin Gun, meaning female warriors. So essentially they were seen as the advance guard of the Japanese expansion, paving the way for merchants, other settlers, and eventually Japanese occupation. All the while they'd be sending money back to Japan, helping their own economy. The newspaper, the Nanyo Nichi Nichi, celebrated 50 years of Japanese presence in Southeast Asia, saying, "In industry we had nothing to boast overseas. As for merchants, only cunning rascals had been produced. They lacked courage. Even though the nation had been open to trade, there wasn't anything to trade with. Rather, it was due to the lead of the adventurous women of Kyushu who sold their pleasures west and east that Japanese trade expanded." So, for instance, if we look at the migrant population in the Philippines at the turn of the 20th century, only 2% of the Chinese community was female, 19% of the American, but over 60% of the Japanese population were women, and the vast majority of these would be prostitutes. One of the agents, or let's just say pimps, was named Muraoka Heihachi. He wrote a pretty contested account of his actions in the build-up to war. He had allegedly found criminals around Japan and got them to commit one last crime, pimping out Japanese women to funnel money back home and thus redeem themselves in the eyes of the nation. In one speech he said, "All of you here have done harm to your country. You have lost your Japanese national character. You can no longer enter your ancestors' graveyards. However, there is still a way to involve you in enterprises for your country." He then goes on to say that these male criminals should join him in pimping. And, just keeping to the Philippines, there were reports of them making a fair chunk of money from American troops primarily, upwards of 30 pesos for their services, which was around the same amount that an unskilled worker would make in a month. In the Philippines, they were stationed largely outside the American military bases for economic reasons, but given the support of the ultra-nationalists, it's hard to imagine no information was leaving the brothels and being sent to the Japanese. Plus, there are many stories from across Asia of their actions. For instance, they helped Uchida Ryoi, the founder of the Black Dragon Society, when he in turn was aiding Sun Yat-sen take over China. While in Siberia, they stole documents which came from a soldier involved with telegraph operations. This, by the way, came before the Russo-Japanese War, so could well have been crucial. But really, it's hard to pin down just how much information they gathered. Many of them serviced and occasionally even married high-ranking military men and officials in French Indochina, China, the Dutch East Indies and more. So they would have been privy to a lot of information, but many of the girls were illiterate, so how great of a spy they would have been could be disputed. However, their actions clearly made the Japanese wary of prostitute spies during their subsequent wars. So when they invaded China, they didn't allow Chinese women to work in the brothels and service Japanese soldiers, as they could be recruited by the enemy soldiers as spies. They therefore forcibly shipped in hundreds of thousands of women from the different corners of their empire. Koreans were disproportionately the victims of this crime, but also Dutch women, Chinese, Papua New Guinean women, and many more suffered as comfort women to the Japanese. But the spies in Japan were usually working for groups like the Black Dragon Society and not really the government at large, or at least the government's role is disputed. Yet Japanese spying missions were incredibly influential. As I've mentioned in other videos, Kenji Dolhara aided revolutions in Japan and orchestrated the Mukden incident, which led to the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. His greatest spy was Yoshiko Kawashima, a cross-dressing Manchu princess. She had been married to the son of a Mongolian warlord fighting for independence against China. His name, by the way, was Babo Jab. So she was working to weaken the Chinese, helped independence fighters, and even though she preferred to dress like a man, she would often pose as a prostitute in opium dens around China and Siberia to get more information. So the role of these women in building up Japanese bases across Asia is pretty hard to dispute. The Japanese government would eventually begin to try and suppress their activities, but by then they had served their role. They had economic bases and increased presence across Asia, and fifth columns everywhere, people ready to rise up in support of a Japanese invasion. But their future wartime ally over in Germany took it one step further and created a whole brothel. This famous institute was run by a woman named Kitty Schmidt, and after trying to escape Nazi control, she was forced to comply with the SS and turn her brothel into a centre of surveillance. This whole operation was the brainchild of Reinhard Heydrich, the head of the SD and possibly one of the most ruthless Nazis. Now, to recruit women, the Berlin police were cracking down on brothels elsewhere, but rounded up the women they deemed most desirable. They were then trained on how to get people to reveal their secrets, speak several languages and the likes. One British spy named Roger Wilson while using his Romanian alias, noted that these prostitutes were particularly well educated. So well educated that he actually realized it was a surveillance center. He correctly guessed listening devices were installed into the walls and a team of people were listening round the clock. Obviously no enemy diplomats came to visit, but it did give the Nazis a chance to listen into the complaints and doubts of their own officials and even Allied visitors. For instance, Galeazzo Ciano, Mussolini's son-in-law, was a frequent visitor, and he apparently called Hitler a ridiculous little clown. But his womanizing was pretty universally known. For instance, Joseph Kennedy, a US ambassador, said, "We would accomplish much more by sending a dozen beautiful chorus girls to Rome than a flock of diplomats and a fleet of airplanes." So, because the Germans were aware of this information, it's probably no surprise to know that the Germans were happy to have him executed, or at least push for his execution during the war. Ciano's father-in-law was actually pretty partial to the occasional affair himself. For instance, he had an affair with Magna Fontage, a French actress and journalist. She fell madly in love with the Duce and even shot the French ambassador to Rome in 1937 after accusing him of stepping in the way of their love. She was then sent back to France to avoid further trouble, and during the war the Nazis used her to spy on the French resistance. But this came to an end in 1943 because she refused to spy on Mussolini and find out if he was looking to make a separate peace with the Allies. Otherwise, diplomats from Spain, Romania and the likes all visited, but what they revealed we really don't know, unfortunately. However, we do know that many high-ranking Nazi officials visited. Joseph Goebbels, for instance, liked watching lesbian shows, Sepp Dietrich would hire the services of 20 women at a time, and Heydrich forced the operators to turn off the microphones, while he had, apparently, very violent sex with the women. Obviously, this wasn't the only brothel that the Nazis ran, as they, just like the Japanese, had military brothels at the fronts, occupied by women they had essentially enslaved from their home countries. For instance, the Germans would recruit many Polish women in what was called a lepanka. One Red Cross driver described the German soldiers examining 2 Polish women. The first one is about 30 years old. "What is this old whore looking for around here?" one of the 3 soldiers laughs. "Bread, sir," asks the woman. "A kick in the ass you get, not bread." The youngest is maybe 15 years old. They open her coat. "This one is ideal for bed," he says. So clearly there were comfort women as well in Europe. But moving on to the Allies side, they had Virginia Hall, who was a one-legged American. She ran a brothel in France gathering information and allegedly working with doctors to give the women a clean bill of health despite having some STIs. This was part of a larger plan to spread the STIs to the German officers. Her story has been covered a lot, but I definitely recommend looking her up. And really, there's a whole host of strange stories out there. For instance, although not a prostitute, Gisela Klein was able to seduce John Profumo. He was an MP at the time, and details of their romance worried the British intelligence agencies. And if his name sounds familiar, well, he would later cause a scandal in the 60s when he lied to Parliament about having an affair with Christine Keeler. So even during the war, people knew he could be easily blackmailed or seduced. But that is where I'll leave it, and my question today is, do you know of any strange stories that I have missed out? Leave them in the comments below.